Welcome back to the Dragon Age A to Z and to the letter F. I'm going to see how many F words we can get in one episode. It's a worthy challenge, I think. Right, we begin with Ferelden.
For Ferelden! For the Grey Wardens!
Ferelden is my favourite place in all of Thedas. They are my people, the Fereldans. They are 100% my people. If you picked me up and popped me down in the world of Thedas, I would head for Ferelden because I'd be like, they're my people, the Fereldans. So, my people. Ferelden was first settled by the human Alamari tribes who ventured across the Frostback Mountains from Olay, fleeing a spirit they called the Shadow Goddess. We don't know much about the Shadow Goddess, or who or what she or it was, but Solus claims to have met her. So, you know. Yeah, in the Alamari tongue, Ferelden means fertile valley, and they settled there quite successfully. In fact, Fereldans of today are descended from the Alamari tribes, and much of their culture lives on. The Alamari were made up of tribes who often fought with each other, so it was quite a tribal society, quite warlike, lots of, like, you know, chieftains going head to head, that kind of thing, people sort of, you know, smaller tribes being swallowed up by bigger tribes, etc, etc. Over the centuries, a rough political system evolved, with nobles emerging in the forms of bands and turns. Several attempts to unite all the clans under a king were made, but it wasn't until the Exalted Age that Calenhad was finally elected king and the Kingdom of Ferelden was finally born. Now, this is interesting, because Calenhad was the start of the Theron bloodline, right? Which is like the Ferelden royal bloodline, right? So the Theron bloodline ruled Ferelden for the next 3 centuries, right? Interestingly, what I found when I was researching this is, as far as I can tell, Ferelden is not actually a hereditary monarchy. They're more like a feudal kind of system where they elect a monarch. It just so happens that for the past 300 years, they've always elected someone from the same bloodline. Right? Because they sort of consider the Calenhad bloodline. It's like, oh, you know, they were descended from Calenhad, so they deserve to be monarch, whatever. But they're not actually officially a hereditary monarchy. That's not how the line passes. They are the monarch is elected by the landsmeet, as far as I can tell. And yet they make this big deal about somebody of the Theron bloodline should be on the throne. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure, but I feel like it's not a hereditary monarchy. The monarch is elected by the landsmeet, but it just so happens that for the past 300 years they've elected somebody from the Theron bloodline because they consider the Theron bloodline kind of, you know, I don't know, special or whatever. But this does kind of explain why Honora is so easily accepted as queen during Origins, despite not being of royal blood. Ferelden has faced many hardships in its history, including occupation by both Tevinter and Olay, although during the occupation with Tevinter it wasn't actually Ferelden yet, that was when it was still all, you know, lots of tribes. It was also ravaged by the Fifth Blight during Origins, which it dealt with on its own, without aid from any other countries. Yes, the country still stands strong. They're quite a resilient bunch, the Fereldans, despite all that they have faced in their history. And I would say Ferelden is fairly unique amongst other countries in Thedas. Outsiders see it as barbaric and chaotic. They've only kind of united and come together relatively recently. It's quite a young country, technically. Like, as an actual united nation, it's quite young. Most of its history is tribal, you know. So yes, people from the outside, the likes of the Orlesians and the Antivans and, you know, the countries that are sort of more well established do kind of tend to see Ferelden as barbaric and chaotic. But when you actually start to look at their culture in depth, it's a lot more interesting than that. So the Fereldans value loyalty, honesty, and freedom above all else. Now, what does freedom look like to a Fereldan? Well, freedom, to the Fereldans, basically means being responsible for yourself. That's what freedom means to them. It kind of looking after yourself, taking responsibility for yourself. That's what it means to them. Kind of, I mean, when I was reading about it, it sort of sounded a little bit kind of like, you know, every man for himself sort of mentality. Which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. So while all the nobles are technically united under a monarch, that monarch doesn't exactly rule as much as oversee. You know what I mean? They're more like a mediator between everyone. So people are expected to be responsible for themselves. Justice is often handed out by local militias and lords rather than like any kind of official police force of any kind. The nobles are all given a fair amount of freedom over how they rule their own lands, and when a lands meet is called, they all get together like a sort of council to vote on the best course of action. Also, I get the impression that it's easier to become a noble in Ferelden as well. They're not quite as snooty about bloodlines and things like that. Despite the fact that they've elected a monarch from the same bloodline for the last 300 centuries. But, like, in general, they don't seem quite as snooty about bloodlines and things. I think it's probably easier to kind of marry into the nobility or just kind of, buy your way into the nobility. The nobility aren't quite as noble. They're more just, like, local leaders rather than, like, some great aristocracy. Yeah, so in general, the Fereldans, who, bearing in mind, have come out of a long Orlesian occupation only a few decades ago, are big on liberty, freedom, that sort of thing, and they're distrustful of authority. That was a big thing that I got from the research I was doing, very distrustful of authority, and they really don't like being told what to do. So, like I said, my people, they're very British. Very British, the Fereldans. I could totally imagine Ferelden voting for Brexit. So, while they have a nobility and a hierarchy, they value honesty and loyalty above bloodlines. Calenhad, their first king, was actually the son of a merchant, and was originally, one of the other candidates for king's servant. So he was a servant to one of the nobles who was vying for king, right? Before he became a candidate himself. So they value your integrity more than your lineage, generally, in Ferelden. It's even stated in a few places that elves have a much better lot in Ferelden than they do anywhere else. That's not to say that they're like, they have full equal rights and live happy, jolly lives or anything. They still live in alienages. They're still treated like second-class citizens. But they have a lot more rights. They're paid better for the work that they do anywhere else, It's also worth noting that if you play the Awakening DLC for Origins, which takes place immediately after the end of Origins, your warden will be made Arl or Arlessa of Amaranthine, regardless of race or class. So, mage, dwarf, elf, doesn't matter, you're nobility now. If you play as a city elf, you can even get your cousin Shiani elected into the Landsmeet as a representative of the alienage. Right? I doubt that would happen in any of the other nations. So my canon warden in my, canon world state, I'm building, an entire sort of Magpie cinematic universe of what my Thedas looks like in my canon playthrough. I've got I've got a massive notebook and lots of Word documents and everything all linked together. One of the things that I've kind of headcanoned is my canon warden is a city elf, right? So she becomes the Arlessa of Amaranthine. So she's like a city elf who was born in the Denerim alienage who is now nobility, right? And then Shiani's elected as a representative of the alienage in the Landsmeet, and Honora is queen. And I've sort of got this headcanon that between the three of them, they sort of improved a lot of elves even more. So the alienages aren't alienages anymore, they're more like elven districts. And the elves get a lot more rights and things like that. That's my sort of headcanon. But I think realistically that it could only happen in Ferelden. I don't think it could really happen in any of the other nations. Maybe Ravain, possibly. But I think, Ferelden, of all the nations, seems to me the most egalitarian of the lot of them. So, we move on to the bit that Fred will be most excited about. A huge part of Ferelden culture revolves around dogs. In particular, the Mabari, who were brought to Ferelden by Tevinter Magisters during the Tevinter occupation, which was many, 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 many moons ago, back in ancient times, before Andraste and all of that. Kind of around the time of Andraste, because she was taken as a slave by Tevinter, but you know what I mean. So it's said that the Magisters bred the Mabari with magic and made them particularly intelligent. Although these days they only really seem to exist in Ferelden. Doesn't seem to be many Mabari outside of Ferelden, so they kind of stayed behind when the Tevinters left. They are known to choose their masters and develop very tight bonds with whoever they decide to follow. It's called imprinting. If a Mabari imprints on you, it's considered a great honour. And they are often seen as a symbol of the nobility, and they are also an important part of the Ferelden army. The Ferelden obsession with dogs is tied into their long history with werewolves. It seems like werewolves plagued the land in Ferelden's early history, and dogs were able to detect them even when they were in human form, or so the legends go. Exactly why Ferelden has such a history with werewolves is kind of unclear. It just seems that when the Alamari tribes first arrived, there were a lot of werewolves in Ferelden. But don't really know why. Why Ferelden particularly would have more werewolves than anywhere else. But, there's a history with werewolves. We might delve into that a bit deeper a bit later in the alphabet. But yes, that's sort of where the obsession with dogs comes from. So, like all nations in Thedas, Ferelden seems to have been loosely based on a real-world country, in this case, Britain. Although it's worth noting that throughout history there have been many different Britons: Roman Britain, Norman Britain, Viking Britain, Saxon Britain, Imperial Britain. Ferelden, however, seems mostly based on Celtic Britain. Sort of like if the Celts had been left alone long enough to actually unite into one nation. That's the kind of vibe that I get. I mean, like the Alamari, I think, are quite clearly based on the Celts. The Fereldans themselves almost seem a little more leaning towards the Saxons, kind of. But it's more like if the Celts became the Saxons, which is not what happened in real-world history. But, you know. But yeah, I get the impression that it's sort of like the Celts if the Celts had actually not been kind of wiped out by various invasions, that it had instead managed to, like, come together and form a nation. That's sort of, I think, what Ferelden is kind of meant to be. So almost all Ferelden characters have Celtic names, for example, although they usually go with the Anglicanized versions of them, like the Anglicanized spellings and even pronunciations. All Aemon or Eamon is the sort of biggest example of that, because technically it should be pronounced Aemon, but most of the characters pronounce it Eamon. Some of them do say Aemon, though. I have noticed one or two of them saying Aemon. A lot of them are also named after sort of quite important people from Celtic mythology, Morrigan and Cullen being the two most notable ones for that. I don't think Flemeth is. I've searched for Flemeth in Celtic mythology, and I assumed that she would be named after someone, and I can't, if she is, I can't find it. But, yeah. Even the obsession with dogs, though, is very Celtic. Dogs and werewolves feature heavily in a lot of Celtic mythology and a lot of old British folklore, even to this day. Like, genuinely, almost every county in Britain has some kind of legend about a dog that roams the land, like a demon dog or a ghost dog or some kind of mythical dog that, like, roams the land or something like that. Like, British folklore is absolutely littered with stuff like that. So yeah, even the obsession with dogs kind of comes back to that. They also do make a point of stating that Ferelden is quite cold, it rains a lot, and the food's really bland. So, although, do you know what? Having said that, if you go on the wiki, there's a huge big paragraph about what they eat in Ferelden, right? And it starts off by saying something along the lines of Ferelden food is considered quite humble and quite bland. And then I was reading about the stuff they eat in Ferelden. I swear to God, I was salivating. It was stuff like bacon and egg pies and like meat stews. And I was just like, oh, it's like all the food I want. And I'm like right in the middle of a diet. I'm like, oh, I just wanted all of it. Also, one last note I will say that quite often when people from other nations are trying to be sort of derogatory towards the Fereldans, particularly the Orlesians, they refer to them as the Dog Lords, which is meant to be an insult. But knowing the Fereldans as I do, I think they would probably take that as a compliment. They probably quite like the fact that people call them the Dog Lords, to be fair. Anyway, shall we move on? Right, we're staying with the geography theme, and we are moving on to the Free Marchers. Probably my second favourite nation, actually, I think. Yeah. Now, this is going to be a very brief overview, because there's a lot to talk about and not enough time to tell it all. So, the Free Marchers are a group of independent city-states, so they're not so much a nation, really. Because each city has their own laws and their own governments, and they're all, like, independent from each other. They were originally settled by human tribes, before being invaded and taken by the Tevinter Imperium. Tevinter actually founded several of the cities that make up the Free Marchers today, including Kirkwall, but we'll get to that later in the alphabet. Mafarath was given the Free Marchers by Tevinter after he betrayed Andraste, so that was like his reward for betraying Andraste, was that he got the Free Marchers. And he gave them to his middle son to rule. At the time, nobody knew that he had betrayed Andraste. However, when his betrayal was revealed, his son relinquished his title and then split the Free Marchers up between various tribes, hence why they never unified into one nation. The Free Marchers is almost like Ferelden if Ferelden had never unified, to be honest. The Free Marchers is just Ferelden without Calenhad. So, the Free Marchers are a very diverse place. Lots of people come and go. They're quite central. Most of the cities are along the coast, so there's a lot of ports, there's a lot of trading goes on. It's quite a hub for sort of commerce. And when I was saying that they're a lot like Ferelden, I think they have the same kind of independent spirit. So while all the cities can pull together under one army in times of particular crisis, the only thing that ever really brings them together is the Grand Tourney, which is an event held every 1,000 days in a different city each time, a bit like Eurovision, only with swords. The city-states that make up the Free Marchers include Arnsberg, which is ruled by a margrave and often referred to as a backwater. Hasmal, which is known for taking escaped slaves from Tevinter. Hercynia, which I have nothing much to say about. It's a place that we know exists. Kirkwall, which is of course the setting for Dragon Age 2, and Kirkwall is ruled by a Viscount, and is also known to have one of the harshest mage circles in Thedas, and there may be all sorts of exciting reasons as to why, but we're going to get to that in the Kirkwall entry, which was a really good entry. It's a really good one, I'm proud of that one. Markham, home to one of the largest universities in Thedas. Ostwick, ruled by a Turn and home to the Inquisitor, and also the setting to my upcoming fanfiction that I might get around to publishing one day, but shh. Starkhaven, ruled by the Vale family, whose leaders take the title of Prince. I don't know if there's ever been a princess of Starkhaven, or if they have to be men. I'm not sure. They also all have Scottish accents. People from Starkhaven. One of my favourite bits in the Dragon Age 2 live streams was when I was talking about Sebastian's Scottish accent, and Fred didn't realise he had a Scottish accent. And I found that fascinating. I was like, that's so obviously a Scottish accent, Fred, but obviously not to an American ear. I found that quite interesting. Anyway, yes, Tanta Vale, ruled by a Chancellor, seems quite strict, pious. The Chantry holds a lot of power. They're sort of quite religious and zealoty, I think, in Tanta Vale. That was the impression that I got from the, 3 sentences in the codex that we have about them. And Wycombe, ruled by a duke and often described as a party city where everybody gets drunk and has orgies, presumably. I'll be honest, I added in the orgy bit. That's more my personal headcanon than any kind of official canon. It's a party place. They consume a lot of alcohol. I just kind of assumed orgies kind of go along with that. So those are the ones that we know about for definite. There may be others. There's mention of both Wildervale and Wilderdale. So I don't know whether either of those are a city, or if they're just a region or a village, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a few other little names that crop up here and there in relation to the Free Marches, but I'm not actually 100% sure whether any of those are cities or not. So those are the ones that we know about for certain. Final note, Navarra City, which is the capital city of the nation of Navarra, was originally a Free Marcher city before it broke away and formed its own sovereign nation of Navarra. So there you go.
Well, what have we here?
Next, Flemeth. Okay, buckle up, kids. This is a biggie. Right, Flemeth, also known as the Witch of the Wilds, the Mother of Vengeance, and Asher Belinar, which is Elven for the Woman of Many Years, is a Ferelden mage who lives in the Kokari Wilds and is one of only 3 characters guaranteed to appear in the first 3 games. The stories around her are murky and hard to sift through, but to give you a general overview, Flemeth was born in Highever, which is a region of Ferelden, around 600 years before the games are set, probably. Although according to Genetivi, there's no record of her ever having existed. But then her name might not actually be Flemeth. She might have picked that name. Who knows what her original name was? She was married to a penniless bard named Osen, but was desired by a lord named Cormac. By the way, these are all names from Celtic mythology as well. When I said the Fereldans are often named after people from Celtic mythology, all of these, Osen and Cormac, are all from Celtic mythology. Anyway, Cormac offered to buy Flemeth off Osen for a high price, and Osen agreed. But he was betrayed by Cormac, who had him slain instead. Flemeth heard of this from the spirits, who whispered to her because she was presumably a mage, and was so furious that she killed Cormac and fled to the Kokari Wilds. At least this is the story that Morrigan tells us in Origins, though interestingly, according to her, Flemeth was mostly pissed that Cormac went back on his word, not that her husband had sold her to someone else. She was totally fine with the deal. She was like, you know what? You need the money. He wants me. You sell me. You get the money. I get a new, richer husband. Fine. She was absolutely, totally dandy about all of that, but it was the fact that Cormac went back on his word and killed Osen. That was what really pissed her off. I want to note that there are different versions of this story in the games. Like a lot of different versions of this story, depending on which codex entries you read. Most of them are like legends. I went with the one that Morrigan tells us because it's the one that's most likely to be accurate. Or at least the most accurate, but of course she got that from Flemeth, and I mean, how honest do you think Flemeth is generally? Who knows? I don't know, but yeah, so there are like different versions of the legend, but I don't have time to tell you all of them, otherwise we'll be here for like 5 hours. But anyway, once in the Kokari Wilds, Flemeth met with a demon who possessed her, and this is what has allowed her to live for centuries and also become something possibly more than a mere mage. We might get to that in a minute. Who the original Flemeth was and the validity of this story is hard to know for certain, to be honest. Everything about Flemeth is kind of hard to know for certain. What we do know is that by the time of the games, Flemeth has become a legend, often popping up at historically pivotal moments in Ferelden's history and interacting with its heroes, including King Marek, the hero of Ferelden, and Hawke. Flemeth is said to dwell mostly in the Kokari Wilds, where she captures chastened men and uses them to sire numerous magical daughters, though by the time of Origins she is only living with one daughter, Morrigan. Morrigan claims not to know whether she had sisters, but the legends claim Flemeth chased her daughters through the forest and ate their hearts. Morrigan later discovers that Flemeth in fact uses her daughters to prolong her lifespan, tutoring them to become powerful mages until she can take their bodies in a ritual that presumably kills them. Though it is hinted at various points that it's more complicated than that, Flemeth herself claims that she couldn't have done the ritual unless Morrigan had been willing, suggesting that her previous daughters were willing? Maybe? Another daughter of Flemeth's, Yavanna, appears in the comic books, where she states that Flemeth's possession ritual is in fact a gift. Whatever the hell that means, I don't know. But yes, Flemeth states that Morrigan was never in any danger from her, so who knows what was going on with that? Flemeth appears to have the gift of prophecy. She hints at Sir Jory's death in Origins. It's suggested by Morrigan that she knew how the Blight was ultimately going to end as well. More importantly, when she encounters Hawke at the beginning of Dragon Age 2, she seems to successfully predict the Into the Abyss quest in Dragon Age Inquisition. Yes, her little prophecy there, it seems to be hinting at that particular quest where Hawke ends up in the Fade. And a lot of people say that Hawke should maybe be the one left in the Fade. And maybe if you leave Hawke in the Fade, Hawke will not actually die in the Fade, but will sort of like, you know, pop up somewhere, maybe in Veilguard, based on that prophecy. Flemeth is also a shapeshifter, and if you choose to fight her in Dragon Age Origins, you will find yourself battling a giant fuck-off dragon. Which, yeah, freaked me out the first time I played, I can tell you that much. So yes, during Morrigan's personal quest, she asks you to slay her mother, to stop her from, you know, killing Morrigan. And you can go to Flemeth's hut and either kill Flemeth, although, spoiler, she doesn't stay dead, or you can make a deal with Flemeth and just sort of let Morrigan think that she's dead. But either way, it doesn't really make a difference, to be honest. So, final note, and massive mega ultra spoilers for anybody who hasn't played the Trespasser DLC. Seriously, just go away for a few minutes until you've played that DLC. You do not want me to spoil this spoiler, alright? If you have not played the Trespasser DLC and you have no idea what I am alluding to, go away, right? Skip ahead, it's fine. I won't hold it against you. Flemeth is later revealed to be possessed by, not a demon, but the elven goddess Mythal herself, the All-Mother who helped the Dreadwolf rebel against the other elven gods. At the end of the Trespasser DLC, she is killed by Solus for reasons that probably make sense to him. But yes, it sort of implies that she's actually been a good person all of this time, because Mythal is very much depicted as like a good person who sort of, you know, fought against the evil elven gods. And you know what? It's worth noting that while Flemeth sort of comes across as a villain in many ways and has a lot of villain qualities, every time you actually encounter her in the games, all she does is help you. In all 3 of the first games, all she does is help you. She's never a threat to you, unless you attack her in Origins. But, like, she's saving your life, she's giving you advice, you know, as much as she seems like she should be a villain, she never poses any threat to you. She's always like a great asset to you. So, you know, maybe she is a hero rather than a villain. BioWare have a few characters like that. Arya in Mass Effect is a character like that. Like, she's so obviously meant to be a villain, and yet every time you encounter her, all she does is help you out. I don't know, she's not actually a threat at any point. So, yeah, Flemeth's an interesting one. Next, Fainriel. Fainriel is an elf-blooded human born to a Dalish mother and an Antivan merchant father. His father, Vincento, abandoned him and his mother when he was born, and his mother, Ariane, was cast out from her clan and raised Fainriel in the Kirkwall alienage. So Fainriel is encountered in Dragon Age 2, where he is revealed to be a mage. His mother refuses to send him to the Circle of Magi, and instead tries to teach him in secret, which she does a fairly good job of, but she does eventually contact the Circle when Fainriel starts having nightmares about demons. Fainriel runs away, because he doesn't want to go to the Circle, and Hawke is tasked with tracking him down. So Hawke can either send him to the Circle against his will, or send him to live with the Dalish outside the city walls, so Keeper Merithari will agree to take him in and train him. Regardless of what choice you make, he reappears again in Act 2 of the game, where he is revealed to be a Dreamer, a particularly powerful and dangerous type of mage with a special affinity for the Fade and all things in it, including demons, spirits, etc. So if a Dreamer were to become an Abomination, which is a mage possessed by a demon, they would be all but unstoppable. So Hawke must venture into the Fade to try and free Fainriel from his nightmares, which he is trapped in. This can result in several outcomes, including Fainriel being possessed, made tranquil, or coming out of the Fade unscathed and heading to Tevinter to get training from the Magisters. Now, the real reason I am mentioning Fainriel is because he is a bit of a continuity error. And not a particularly obvious one either, because... well, do you know what? I'll explain. It's established, though pretty well hidden within Dragon Age lore, that the child of an elf and a human is always genetically human, right? This is established in the book The Calling, written and published long before Dragon Age 2 came out, it's worth noting. So it's not like they just retconned it. It's not like, you know, at the time of Dragon Age 2 they hadn't quite worked this out yet. No, it has always been a thing in the Dragon Age universe that when an elf and a human have a child together, that child is genetically human. Alistair, one of the main characters in Origins, Alistair is elf-blooded and yet fully human. And yet, Fainriel appears to have slightly elven ears in Dragon Age 2, an oversight I find genuinely astounding. Now, on the one hand, the whole elf-blooded humans thing isn't mentioned that often in the games. The Dragon Age games are weird like this. There's a lot of, like, really massive, very important aspects of the lore that you could easily miss playing the games. If you're not the kind of person who delves into the codex entries and reads all the books and consumes all of Dragon Age lore, you could easily miss the fact that the children of a human and an elf is always genetically human, because it's not something that's talked about a lot. So yeah, you could easily play all the games multiple times and just never stumble across that fact, ever. On the other hand, it's a pretty big flipping part of the lore, like I've just said. Like, you would think that at some point in the development process, somebody would have noticed. Like, it's not like he's a little side character who appears only once, either. I mean, alright, he's not exactly a main character, but he's a recurring character in a fairly central quest line. And it appears that nobody picked up on the fact that he's definitely not supposed to have slightly pointed ears. Yeah. I mean, was it Patrick Weeks? It was one of them, one of the, you know, important ones, came out and said, oh, it was probably just an oversight in his design. And I was like, how the hell do you have an oversight like that? Like, where? Did you not have people working on it who actually knew about Dragon Age? Christ almighty. I mean, to be fair, I do know that they were very pushed for time when they were developing Dragon Age 2, but still. But yeah, he throws a bit of a spanner into the works, because the thing, like I say, the thing about elves and humans only being able to have human children, it's so well hidden that you could easily miss it. Whereas Fainriel, you can't miss Fainriel. I mean, I don't think you can not do those quests in Dragon Age 2, or it's certainly not likely that you wouldn't do them. So, like, most people who just play the games and don't read the books or anything like that are probably going to think that when a human and an elf have a child, they'll have slightly pointed elven ears. And it's like, no. He's a continuity error. He's not meant to be there. Not meant to have slightly elven ears. So that's basically why I mentioned him. I thought it was kind of important. Yeah, so anyway. Finally, this brings us on to our last entry, Fiona. So, Fiona is an Orlesian elven mage, and at various different times in her life, she is a Grey Warden, a lover of King Marek, mother of Alistair, Grand Enchanter of the Circle of Magi, and leader of the Mage Rebellion. So she gets about a little bit, does Fiona. We first encounter her in the book The Calling, where she travels into the Deep Roads with King Marek and a young Duncan, with whom she is quite close friends, where they encounter the Architect, the intelligent Darkspawn encountered in the Awakening DLC for Origins, and potentially one of the Magisters who travelled into the Golden City. So there you go. During the events of the book, Fiona becomes the first known Grey Warden to be cured of the Darkspawn taint, though it is really not made even remotely clear how. It's something to do with the Architect and something and something and something else, and oh, Fiona was cured of the Darkspawn taint and nobody knows It may become relevant in Veilguard. Inquisition already hinted that the hero of Ferelden may be looking for a cure to the taint, and we do know that the Grey Wardens seem to be going to play a fairly major role. I mean, we get to go to Weishaupt. We've got a Grey Warden companion. You can be a Grey Warden yourself if you want to, so, you know, it might become relevant. So in Inquisition, Fiona states that the Wardens tried to make her undergo the joining again, but she was completely immune, and nothing that they did could make her a true Warden again. I'm assuming she's also still immune to the taint generally, like if she got attacked by a Darkspawn, she wouldn't end up with the Blight. Yeah, so she's just like completely immune to the taint, which is another like really massive important part of the lore, which is just kind of like, yeah, we're just gonna gloss over that. You know, we've got this person who's immune to the Blight and was cured of the Grey Warden taint, but it's fine, we will hardly mention her. We'll make her a small side character in one of the games that you could easily miss. Dragon Age does this a lot, just like massive, huge plot points that are just like really just shuffled away into a corner somewhere. It's just like, I feel like I should be drawing more attention to this, but no, it's fine. Anyway, during the book, Fiona and Marek briefly become lovers, and she returns from Weishaupt at the end of the book with baby Alistair, who she reveals to be Marek's son. It appears that after this she left the Wardens, as many of them resented the fact that she had cheated death by becoming immune to the taint. I wonder if Alistair had something to do with her becoming immune to the taint, actually. That's just popped into my head, because it's just occurred to me that Grey Wardens tend not to be able to conceive children, or at least not easily. So you must have been conceived just like... You see, it's been so long since I read the book, I can't remember the specifics, and I was going off the synopsis in the wiki. Because I do not have time to sit down and read the book, you know, before this video has to go out. So yeah, she left the Grey Wardens because she sort of didn't fit in anymore, even though she was presumably still immune to the Blight, but I assume that she didn't have her sort of Grey Warden abilities, like being able to hear the Darkspawn and things like that. So she wouldn't have been very effective as a Grey Warden anyway. So she returned to the Circle of Magi, and she rose to the rank of First Enchanter at the Circle of Monsimard in Orlais, before becoming Grand Enchanter of the Circle. She appears again in the book Asunder, where she leads a vote to rebel against the Circle after Anders' destruction of the Chantry and Kirkwall, but is thwarted by Wynne, and over the next couple of years she calls 2 more votes to separate from the Circle, with the 3rd finally being successful, and she becomes the leader of the Mage Rebellion. So it's all her fault, really. You can blame Anders for blowing up the Chantry, but that didn't exactly kick off the Mage Rebellion. The Mage Rebellion carried on brewing for a good while after that, and it was Fiona who really sort of pushed for the mages to rebel and break away from the Circle. And yes, eventually she was successful, and she got the answer that she wanted. I kind of like the idea that, like, she called a vote, right? She wanted to break away from the Circle, so she called a vote, right? And they were like, no. So rather than just accepting that, she's like, well, I'm just going to keep calling votes until you say yes. Sort of like, kind of like that. I like that tenacity. Sort of like, well, you know, I'll just keep doing it until I get the answer I want. Anyway, the first time we encounter her in the games is during Inquisition, where she is leading the rebel mages in Redcliffe, and has entered into an unwise alliance with Magister Alexius, basically agreeing to become slaves of the Imperium, because apparently that is so much better than being in the Circle.
Fiona, dear, your dementia is showing.
Honestly, like, I understand that they had legitimate reasons to rebel, alright? I'm not one of those who thinks that just because others have it worse, that means you shouldn't try to improve your own lot. That's not what I am saying, right? They had total reason to rebel, right? The Templars had gone off it, the Chantry and the Circle were just like a mess. They had, you know, something was going to have to give at some point. They were completely justified in rebelling. But rebelling against the Circle because you want more freedom, safety, and respect, and then agreeing to sell yourself into slavery to the Imperium makes literally no sense. Right? That makes no sense whatsoever. Like, you are out of the frying pan and into the fire a bit there, love, but anyway. Yes, what becomes of Fiona depends very much on your choices in-game, and who eventually becomes divine. Should the mages be recruited or conscripted into the Inquisition, you can talk to her in Skyhold, where she may inquire after Alistair, assuming he's alive. She will then join the Reformed Circle at the end of the game and lead a new College of Enchanters. If you recruit the Templars instead of the mages, however, Fiona joins the Venatori, and you have to fight her during the invasion of Haven. Yeah, so... yeah, she makes a string of unwise choices, really, as leader of the Rebel Mages, but anyway. So, yes, that was the letter F. We have a few honourable mentions, including Emperor Florian, who was the Emperor of Orlais during the Orlesian occupation of Ferelden, when King Marek rose up against him and took Ferelden back. Duchess Floriane, who you encounter in Dragon Age Inquisition, the niece of Emperor Florian, and presumably named after him, who is the big villain of the Winter Palace. Fenris, of course. I had to miss out Fenris. Sorry, Fenris, darling. But, yeah, I'm trying not to make these videos too long. And, I don't know, I'm trying not to have too many massive topics in one video, you know what I mean? Fen'Harel. We sort of covered Fen'Harel a little bit in the last episode, and I was just kind of like, you know. But Fen'Harel has many names, so we might cover him under a different name a bit later in the alphabet. And the Fade! I actually had Fred write a script for the Fade. And it's an odd one, because on the one hand, the Fade is a huge part of the Dragon Age world. On the other hand, we know almost nothing about it, and there was actually very little to say about it. And Fred wrote a script, bless him, and I scrapped it. I was like, nah, I'm putting Fainreal in instead. Sorry, Fred. But it's alright. Fred will be making a comeback in the next episode, I think. What's next? G. Did he contribute to G? Oh, he definitely contributed to G. I think he wrote half of G, actually. Yeah, so Fred's writing talents will be back in the next episode, which will be tomorrow. I will see you then, my lovelies.